name's Amanda and welcome to the very last video in my half square triangle sampler Quilt Along series. So in this very last tutorial I will be showing you how to make and also attach a very simple binding to your quilt, and then how to label it so you have a lovely and beautiful finished quilt. So the binding that I'm going to show you how to make is one that I call a cheats binding, because we're cutting it against the straight grain of the fabric and not the cross grain or the bias of the fabric. So the fabric that I'm using for the binding is this one. This is called Stripe, and this one is also from the Sultan's Garden range. As soon as I saw this fabric on the sample cut, I knew I had to use it for the binding because I absolutely love a good striped binding, and it just has all of the colours that are within all of the other prints, and I knew that it would just sort of tie everything together and just, yeah, look really great. So the amount of fabric that you'll need for the binding is about 40 centimeters times the width of fabric, and if you're using yards there is a correct measurement listed in the description box below. And then for the label, I've decided to do another hexi label. I did one of these in my last Quilt Along series for the quilt label, and I just absolutely love the idea of doing this. I've just used scrap fabrics from the fabrics that I've used in the quilt, and it just ties in it really nice. This is actually the first hexi flower I made. When I was writing on it, I made a mistake, so I had to make another one, which is now on the quilt. So I actually don't really know what I'm going to do with this one. It's just got like a big fat mistake in the middle of it, so I don't know. So with all of that said, this is how we bind and label our quilt. So the first thing we need to do is square up the quilt. Do this by taking a long quilting ruler and evenly lining it up against an outside edge. Using a rotary blade, carefully trim the excess batting and backing from the quilt. Then move the quilt down, line the ruler back into place, and cut off the remaining edge. Then from here, continue to follow the same set of steps to trim off the remaining excess batting and backing. Next, take the fabric you've chosen for the binding and fold the width over twice. Straighten the edge on the right and then proceed to cut 6 2.5 inch strips from along the width of the fabric. At the sewing machine, take 2 strips and place the ends together, right sides facing, with one selvage at the top and the other facing towards the left. If you need to, pin the strips into place and then sew a 45-degree line through the center of where they overlap. If sewn correctly, they should open out to create a continuous binding strip. Then from here, continue to sew each of the strips together end to end. Next, trim off the selvage triangles using a ruler and blade, leaving a 1/4 inch allowance behind. At the ironing board, cut the selvage off from one end and then press it over at about 1/2 inch. This will be the beginning end of our binding. Then carefully press the whole length of the binding in half using a medium to hot steamy iron. When you reach the seam joints, open them out with your fingers and then gently press them flat with the iron. Then continue on pressing the binding in half. At the sewing machine, place the folded beginning end of the binding along the front bottom edge of the quilt, leaving about 1 to 2 inches of binding behind the walking foot. With the right hand side edge of the foot lined up with the raw edges of the quilt and binding, make a small back stitch to begin and proceed to carefully sew the binding into place along the front of the quilt. When you reach a corner, make a small back stitch about a 1/4 inch away from the end edge and remove the quilt from the machine. Turn the quilt around to the next edge that will be sewn and fold the binding up onto itself, creating a 45-degree angle. Ensure that the tip of the fold is lining up with the corner edge of the quilt. Then carefully fold the binding back over the 45-degree fold line, creating a straight fold along the top edge. Place the quilt and binding back under the machine foot, make a small back stitch and continue sewing the binding to the front side of the quilt. Once you've come back to the point where you started, stop about 4 to 5 inches away from the beginning. Roughly cut off the excess binding with scissors, leaving enough binding to comfortably tuck into the beginning end. Then carefully sew over the 2 ends and finish the stitching with a small back stitch. After removing the quilt from the machine, begin folding the binding around to the back and clipping it into place. When you reach the corners, trim away any excess threads and fold over the first edge. Then take the opposite one and fold it over on top of the last, and then clip it into place the best way you can. Continue to do this until the binding on all 4 edges of the quilt have been turned over and clipped into place. Next, take a hand sewing needle and matching thread and tie a double knot at the end. Bury the knot under the backing and proceed to sew a slip stitch type of stitch between the binding and backing, bringing both together and hiding the raw edge of the quilt. At the corners, pick up the folded corner with the needle, make a small stitch underneath, and then continue on slip stitching the binding down. When you reach the end of your thread, make a small stitch and pull the needle through the loop that it creates and make a knot. Plunge the needle back under the binding, bringing the end out along the outside edge of the binding, and then snip the thread, leaving the tail buried safely in place. So for my quilt label, I've pieced together my scrap fabrics into a lovely hexy flower. In the center, I've written the date the quilt was finished, its name and who made it, using a fine tip fabric marker. Next, I unpick the tacking stitches and take the cardboard templates out from the back of each hexie. Next, I give the hexie flower a good steamy press on the back and front, and then apply some spray starch to ensure everything stays in place. Using enough heat and bond or Vliesofix to cover the back of the hexie flower, I roughly cut a few of the edges to size and then lightly press it into place using a warm to hot dry iron. I then continue to trim off the rest of the edges around the hexie flower and then give it a good press for about 30 seconds on both the front and back. Choosing either the left or right hand bottom corner of the quilt, I peel away the backing paper and line it up into place. Then I patiently press the label onto the quilt for another 30 seconds. Then, with a matching embroidery thread, I use 2 strands to embroider the label to the quilt. To do this, make a knot at the end of the thread and bring the needle to the surface at the point where you want to start, anchoring the knot within the batting. Carefully begin sewing a blanket stitch or buttonhole stitch along each edge of the hexie flower, while making sure that the thread doesn't show through the front side of the quilt. To finish the stitch, make a small tack over the last stitch to keep it in place. Then make another, but this time bringing the needle up away from the stitching. Cut the thread off as close to the surface as possible, leaving the tail buried in the batting. And with any luck, you should now have a beautifully finished half square triangle sampler quilt. So a big thank you to all of you who have joined in on the series. Your support and encouragement and participation truly do mean the world to me, and you've just made this whole process, the whole series, just totally worth it. Now I really do hope that you're all happy with the way that your quilts have turned out. I know that I am. It's exactly the way that I had pictured it in my head, and it's actually turned out a lot better than what I thought, to be honest. Of course, don't forget to share your finished quilts with me. I would absolutely love to see them, especially as we've been doing this series for quite a while. We've all sort of bonded over it. So because of that, I would absolutely love to see it. Now before I go, I just want to say a big huge thank you to Debut Textiles, who so nicely gave me the fabrics to make this quilt in this series. They're a company here in Australia who distribute all of the big name American fabrics to all of the lovely stores here in Australia. So without them, this series would not have happened, to be perfectly honest. So thank you very much to them. So best of luck to everyone in finishing your quilts. Don't forget to label it. Never skip that part, because I think that's one of the most important bits. Again, thank you all so much for joining in and making this series a very successful one. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you another time very soon. Bye! So in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to piece together our backing, how to baste our quilt together, and then essentially quilt it in the way that I have, as you can see in the background, in like a crisscross grid like